I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. How did doctors discover vaccination, and what did milkmaids have to do with it? Why have vaccines become controversial? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Peter Hotez is one of the world's leading vaccine experts. He'll share the milkmaid's tale from the 18th century and bring us up to date on 21st century mRNA vaccines.
Parents don't worry about polio or whooping cough anymore because the vaccines are so effective. Smallpox has been eradicated.
How did vaccines turn into a political football? What can we do about it?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how vaccine diplomacy can help prevent the next pandemic.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the CDC has relaxed its recommendations about mask wearing. People who are vaccinated no longer need to wear a mask outside unless they're in a crowd. CDC has not lifted its rules about wearing masks inside, though, and new research from MIT suggests that maintaining 6 feet of distance between people indoors is not very effective. Two mathematicians devised modeling simulations of indoor spaces and found that ventilation, mask wearing, the number of people, and their behavior, exercising, singing, or speaking, had a bigger impact on the potential for infection. Writing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they conclude, to minimize the risk of infection, one should avoid spending extended periods in highly populated areas. With nearly 40% of American adults vaccinated, COVID-19 cases are dropping, but millions of Americans are still vulnerable to infection. With tens of thousands of new cases every day, limiting time indoors and wearing masks seems prudent.
Many people have discounted the long-term consequences of COVID-19. They point out that most people are asymptomatic or recover readily from the initial infection, but new research involving 73,000 individuals who get their health care through the Department of Veterans Affairs shows that even after people recover, they're at high risk for complications. These were people who were not hospitalized with COVID-19. Nevertheless, they were more likely to experience problems of the nervous system, heart, digestive tract, muscles, joints, and metabolism. These long haulers were also at increased risk of dying compared to 5 million patients who did not catch COVID-19. Another study from the CDC found that more than 2/3 of people who were not hospitalized when they had COVID-19 needed follow-up outpatient care during the first 6 months after recovery. The CDC is alerting clinicians and healthcare systems that many, even those with mild or asymptomatic infections, are likely to need additional health care after COVID.
Preventing COVID infections remains a high priority, and vaccines are proving to be very effective in this effort. A study in the CDC publication, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, reveals that people over 65 who've had both shots reduce their risk of hospitalization by 94%. The researchers evaluated patients at 24 hospitals in 14 states. The findings in the real world are similar to those from the clinical trials of the vaccines. Partially vaccinated people reduced their risk of hospitalization by about 64%. Good, but not as impressive as full vaccination.
Two different research teams are claiming success with a new urine test to diagnose prostate cancer. Investigators at the University of Michigan and the University of East Anglia in the UK have used genetic markers in urine to identify aggressive prostate cancers. Both sets of researchers believe that their test will enable doctors to tell which men require further treatment and who can benefit from active surveillance.
Some experts who study Alzheimer's disease have suggested it's closely linked to the metabolic problems of diabetes. A new study of British civil servants confirms that people with type 2 diabetes are at higher risk of developing dementia. The research began in 1985 and included more than 10,000 volunteers. Doctors examined these individuals approximately every 4 years until 2019. During that time, 1,700 people got a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. In addition, there were 639 cases of dementia. Analysis of the data shows that the risk of developing dementia rises as people get diabetes at younger ages. The investigators conclude younger age at onset of diabetes was significantly associated with higher risk of subsequent dementia. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
Vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 are changing the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic. Israel was one of the first countries to implement widespread vaccinations. The country went from surges and pervasive outbreaks and lockdowns to something resembling normal life. Health authorities there predicted a plateau and then a decline in new cases once about half a population is vaccinated.
Almost 40% of American adults have been vaccinated. A study published on April 28th in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report shows that older people who are fully vaccinated have a 94% lower risk of COVID-19 hospitalization. Virus cases have dropped in more than half of the states over the last 2 weeks, presumably in response to rising vaccination rates.
To learn more about the vaccines against COVID-19 and other diseases, we turn to Dr. Peter Hotez. He's a professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He's also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Dr. Hotez is the author of several books. His latest is Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science.
Dr. Peter Hotez, welcome to the People's Pharmacy.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Hotez, it is a great honor to be talking to you today. You are one of the experts that everybody turns to when the topic is COVID. When I was a child, a little over 2 years of age, I contracted polio. I was in a polio ward at Philadelphia Children's Hospital, where one of your colleagues works, Dr. Paul Offit. I also developed whooping cough as a child, and I think my parents feared I was going to die both times, both because of polio. Children were dying all around me in that isolation ward, and because of whooping cough, because it too can be a fatal disease. Parents today, for the most part, don't think twice about those diseases. Can you tell us how vaccines have changed the world?
Well, you're absolutely right. Back in the 1950s, parents lived in abject fear of the summer because of polio epidemics, and oftentimes they would actually leave cities because there were often large urban outbreaks, and they lived in terror of whooping cough, which is pertussis, and all of the other vaccines that all of the other diseases that we now can vaccinate against. I mean, I had a more modern experience when I was a pediatric house officer in Boston at Mass General Hospital, which is one of the first children's services in the country. And, this was in the 1980s, not that long ago. I was admitting a kid every 2 weeks with something called Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis. It was a devastating disease. And back then, as a house officer, you'd have to do the lumbar puncture and look at the cerebral spinal fluid under the microscope, and your heart sank when you saw the organisms after doing what's called a gram stain. and that was just a regular occurrence. And then a new vaccine came online, developed by John Robinson, Rachel Schneerson at NIH, and another similar vaccine developed out of industry in Rochester. And then the disease disappeared within a couple of years. By the time I was an attending physician, pediatrician at Yale Children's Hospital, it was a disease I talked about purely for historic interest, and that's the power of a vaccine.
Well, while we're talking about historic interest, you have quite a fascinating section in your book, Preventing the Next Pandemic, about the history of vaccination. We tend to think of it as something that's quite recent. Would you tell us how long have people been doing something like vaccination?
Well, our first modern vaccine in the sense was developed by Edward Jenner in England, in the British countryside in the late 1700s. But, efforts to immunize people, especially kids, against infectious diseases actually goes back centuries to a process called leishmanization, where this was done in Central Asia and in other parts of the world, where you would immunize a child with a leishmania papule, and often immunize them on the legs or in the buttocks, so it prevents you from getting a full scar on the face. And we also vaccinated against smallpox using smallpox pustules, and you would re-inoculate somebody with it, with oftentimes a good effect, but oftentimes serious side effects. So we've been trying to do this for hundreds of years, and it's only in modern times that we've perfected it to the point where we can reliably show that vaccines are not only of high levels of protection, like what we're seeing with the COVID-19 vaccines, but also are very safe. And that's been a very impressive process to see how the science of vaccines, what we call vaccinology, has progressed over the last few decades.
Well, could you describe the devastation of smallpox and tell us about the milkmaid story?
Millions of people died annually of smallpox. It was the single leading killer of people globally, and it arguably killed more people than all wars in the 20th century. That's the level of devastation that we're talking about. And now we've been able to find a way to vaccinate people, and the word vaccinate is from the Latin, from the word cow, because it was a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms, who Edward Jenner saw seemed to be protected against smallpox because she had actually developed smallpox on her hand, and used that to prepare an immunogen, to prepare a vaccine. Again, the Latin derivation.
Now, Dr. Hotez, what she had on her hands was cowpox, wasn't it?
That's
rather
right.
Than smallpox?
That's right. So she had developed cowpox from milking cows. Now, there's actually been some revisionist studies to suggest that the original virus may have been closer to horsepox rather than cowpox, but you get the idea. It was still highly protective, and it was far safer than immunizing with the actual smallpox virus. And then Jenner took this on in a big way. In fact, when you read the early history of his efforts to develop a smallpox vaccine, he was invited to the local medical society, which I think was called the Convivo Medical Society, but it's recorded that he was asked to stop attending because he was so obsessed with the idea of a vaccine that they couldn't get him to talk about any other topic, and so they finally excluded him from the society, which is kind of interesting. So he had this drive, this obsession, which is actually with us to this day. If you look at the history of all of our major vaccines, you see one or two champions who were, really tried hard to push this concept, and that's been a recurring theme around vaccines.
Well, how did we get from the natural process that Jenner was using, a relatively natural process of using cowpox to immunize against smallpox, to today's very high-tech, highly controlled vaccines?
Well, in some cases, we still use traditional methods. So, for instance, if you look at the landscape of the COVID-19 vaccines, the Chinese have two vaccines from Sinovac and Sinopharm, and India has a virus vaccine. That's the whole virus grown up and then it's inactivated. So that's about as old school as you get. That goes back to an approach used for the Salk polio vaccine. But there are more modern methods by which you can produce a component of the pathogen via genetic engineering technologies, whether it's through developing a recombinant protein like we're doing, or putting it into an adenovirus vector like what AstraZeneca and J&J have done, or just immunizing with the RNA in a lipid shell, which is what Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech have done. Interestingly, they all work the same way. Old school and new school approaches all work by delivering the spike protein in one form or another, and then inducing what are called virus neutralizing antibodies, which are so critical for protection.
Now, I hate to bring this up, but there are a lot of rumors on the web that the mRNA vaccine will change our basic biology permanently. I'm sure you've heard this. Why is that wrong?
It's unfortunate that we've allowed the anti-vaccine lobby to expand to the point where it dominates our internet. And when you're trying to get information about vaccine, you're more likely to get misinformation or even disinformation. And the difference between the two is disinformation is a deliberate intent to deceive. And now we know this is coming from anti-vaccine groups in the United States. It's coming from the Russian government. It's coming from several different sources. And one of the myths or deliberate pieces of disinformation is that the mRNA vaccines will modify your DNA. They even use the term GMH. You've heard of GMO, genetically modified organisms. They're using the term GMH, genetically modified humans. And it's ridiculous because the mRNA, first of all, it goes into the cytoplasm of our cell, not the nucleus, and it gets made into protein which is presented to the immune system. So there is no genetic modification. I mean, as I like to say, there's a reason why you took high school biology. If for nothing else, it was to learn that the cell has a nucleus and has a cytoplasm and has something called DNA in the nucleus and RNA that's expressed into protein in the cytoplasm. And if you know that, you would know that it's a bit absurd.
You're listening to Dr. Peter Hotez. He is a professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He's also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Dr. Hotez is the author of several books. His latest is Preventing the Next Pandemic: Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science.
After the break, we'll learn more about vaccine diplomacy.
How has Russia weaponized health communications?
We've been talking about viruses. Are there vaccines against other types of infections?
We'll also find out about the vaccines Dr. Hotez has been working on against parasitic diseases like schistosomiasis. Do we need vaccines against mosquito-borne diseases like chikungunya?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
You've probably heard us talk about the many health benefits of cocoa flavanols and some of the recent scientific research that's come out about how these powerful plant-based compounds can improve your memory.
We've been fans of Cocoa Via supplements for years because they contain the highest levels of cocoa flavanols on the market and have been independently tested for quality. For those of you that are curious about how cocoa flavanols can improve your memory and heart health, now is the time to try them.
Cocoa Via is offering up to 35% off supplements site-wide, including Memory Plus, which has been shown to improve 3 different aspects of memory. Go to CocoaVia, that's CocoaVia.com, to take advantage of these limited time prices.
The sale ends today, so don't procrastinate.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany. KAYABiotics.com.
Also by Cocoa via Cocoa Flavanol supplements for brain and heart. Available at cocovia.com.
Today we're talking about how to prepare for the next pandemic.
Our guest is Dr. Peter Hotez. He's a professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He's also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Dr. Hotez is the author of several books. His latest is Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science.
Dr. Hotez, your book is subtitled Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science. And we'll get to the vaccine diplomacy in a moment, but it seems like we are living in an anti-science period of time in this country and maybe in the world for that matter. And we recently had an opportunity to talk to one of the world's foremost authorities on aerosol transmission of viruses, Dr. Lindsay Marr. And after the show, we got a number of messages. It's all a hoax. How could you guys possibly believe this COVID-19 thing is happening and that there are so many deaths? It's a hoax. I'm never going to listen to the People's Pharmacy again. How do we deal with this anti-science attitude?
Yeah, no, it's terrible, and unfortunately, it's become a force that's causing devastation not only in the United States but also globally. And I like to say the reason 500,000 Americans lost their lives is partly due to the SARS coronavirus type 2, but in equal measure, it was the defiance around masks and social distancing, and now defiance against vaccine and vaccine refusal that's contributing so much to the deaths in the United States. And we're seeing this as a global movement. You know, it started in a interesting way. The modern history was around false claims that vaccines cause autism, and this started with a fake paper that was published in the Lancet in the late 1990s. And in the past, there have been anti-vaccine, anti-science movements, but back then you did not have something called the internet or social media, and that's had a huge amplifying effect. So the anti-vaccine movement, which began in England in the late 1990s, moved quickly to the United States, and we started to see large numbers of parents opt their kids out of getting vaccinated because of fears that vaccines cause autism. And I got involved in this because I'm not only a vaccine scientist and pediatrician, but I'm also the parent of 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities. And I wrote a book that debunked it all called Vaccine, with the appropriate title, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, going into the science of why vaccines don't cause autism, the evidence for and what autism is, and how it begins in early fetal brain development through the action of more than 100 genes, including one of the genes that we identified in Rachel through whole exome sequencing. And I think that had some impact on the anti-vaccine movement, a deleterious impact. But what they did was they needed to re-energize. And the way they re-energized was around 2014, 2015. They became a political movement under this banner that they called health freedom or medical freedom. And basically it came down to, wasn't even, the autism thread continues to this day, but now a major feature is government can't tell us what to do about vaccinations. And unfortunately in 2020, it accelerated even more after COVID to glom on protests against masks and social distancing. So it was no longer just an anti-vaccine movement. It was an anti-COVID prevention, anti-science movement, because then it started to discredit scientists. It felt it had to attack scientists like myself, and you've heard about the attacks on Dr. Fauci and others. And now it's starting in last year also. It expanded to European capitals. You had anti-mask, anti-vaccine rallies across Western European capitals, and with reports that was linked to QAnon coming from the New York Times and the BBC. And if that wasn't complicated enough, Now, U.S. and British intelligence report that the Russian government under Putin has launched a systematic war against Western vaccines and is attacking the credibility of COVID-19 vaccines in order to destabilize governments and to destabilize democracy. So now what we're dealing with, and to be honest and frank with you, I'm having a hard time convincing people of this. Maybe it's just because I'm on the front lines and I deal with this on a regular basis because of who I am. I see this as, and I don't know the exact term to use, a global anti-science confederacy or empire. And it's deadly. People are losing their lives because of this disinformation. And I feel it's really important that we start looking at some infrastructure to counter it.
Well, Dr. Hotez, it's easy to see why the Russian government might be interested in denigrating the vaccines that are being used elsewhere because they have a competing vaccine. So, it's sort of like bad talk the competition. But
although it actually began before then, and a number of studies have now, there is even a term for it, for what the Russians are doing. They're calling it weaponized health communication, and it's being used as a wedge issue to sow discord among democracies. So presumably the goal is to destabilize democracies, and among the lead issues Putin has chosen, or the Russian government has, and Russia Today and their other media news outlets, is to discredit science and scientists, and that is a reality.
Unfortunately, it looks like they're being fairly successful. I would like to talk about vaccine diplomacy, and I'm hoping you'll be able to tell us what that is.
So vaccine diplomacy is kind of the opposite of the anti-science movement. It says that vaccines are such powerful technologies and have such a major impact on improving health and also improving global economies and securities after we've seen what COVID-19 can do, that there are opportunities to look at an expanded role for vaccines as instruments of foreign policy. And the concept really began when Albert Sabin developed the oral polio vaccine. He did this jointly with Soviet scientists at the height of the Cold War, right after the Sputnik launch, of two countries putting aside their ideologies to work together to create a life-saving vaccine. And during the 50s and into the 60s, Soviet and U.S. scientists cooperated through back-channel diplomacy and diplomatic efforts to work together on polio, but also smallpox, to work together on the eradication of smallpox. So the Soviets had worked out a way to mass produce a freeze-dried vaccine that could be carried all over the world into remote areas, and it would stay good. That was a problem with the Jenner vaccine back in the 1700s. It was hard to keep it because it was a live virus, a cowpox/horsepox virus. It was hard to keep it going. And then we kind of let it fall apart a bit. And I tried to resurrect it when I served as U.S. science envoy in the Obama administration. I had the idea that it was such a powerful approach that why aren't we doing this with other countries? So when Obama created the U.S. Science Envoy program, and he did that after his 2009 speech in Cairo, the New Beginning speeches about reaching out to the Muslim world in the arts and sciences, I said, this might be the opportunity to do it. And I was finally tapped in 2014 to serve as a science envoy for the Middle East and North Africa to build joint vaccine diplomacy efforts with Middle Eastern, North African countries. I loved it. We made some progress too. But I think it's the way we need to go, and the way we need to counter the opposite of this crazy vaccine nationalism, as we sometimes call it.
Right. But, having had polio as a child, I'm asking myself, well, why haven't we eradicated polio completely from the world? We have the tools. What's happened?
Well, I think there's a few things. There's a little piece of biology that does make it more complicated than smallpox, and that has to do with the fact that with smallpox, if you had the virus, you knew it. You were sick. You had a very characteristic rash, and it was possible then to ring fence the case. So this was figured out by D.A. Henderson's team, Bill Foege and Sarah de Quadros and others. worked out that if they vaccinate everybody around it in this ring vaccination strategy, you could halt it. And that was used again for Ebola, because Ebola is a similar type of situation. If you got Ebola, you were sick. And that was proven to be an effective strategy for the Merck vaccine in DR Congo in 2019. Problem with polio is by the time you see a kid with acute flaccid paralysis from polio, there may be 100 others that are already infected but with no symptoms. And so what that means is it doesn't afford you the luxury of ring fencing. It means you have to go into a community and vaccinate absolutely everybody. And that's not easy to do. I mean, you have to get really high vaccination coverage. And then we have pockets of instability in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, or northern Nigeria where the Boko Haram is. And so and then we've seen breakthrough cases in the conflict zones on the Arabian Peninsula. So this is something that is slowing us down. I think we'll get there. But it's technically more complicated to eradicate polio or eliminate polio than some of the other things that we do.
Well, you have definitely made it clear in your book, Preventing the Next Pandemic, that conflict, wars, poverty, political instability, climate change, they all contribute to the difficulty of trying to eradicate an infectious disease. I do want to ask about a different type of vaccine. We tend to think of vaccines as affecting viruses, Zika virus perhaps, although I don't think we have a vaccine for that yet. Ebola virus, you just mentioned, smallpox, measles, they're all viruses. But you and your team have been developing vaccines against other types of infections. Could you tell us about that briefly, please?
That's right. Although from all my cable news appearances, people think I'm a virologist. The answer is not really. I mean, I've spent most of my life focused on vaccines for parasitic infections in low and middle income countries, but we adopted a coronavirus vaccine program because that was orphaned like the rest of them 10 years ago. And of course, now people recognize the importance of it. But around 20 years ago, I began this concept of seeing if we can produce vaccines for the world's poorest people and do this in the nonprofit sector. We did it through George Washington University, and helping me in this has been my science partner for the last 20 years, Mary Elena Bottazzi, to see if we can explore the concept of making parasitic disease vaccines, which involves a lot of interesting science. But as I often point out, the science is only half the challenge. The other half is figuring out the sustainable business model for making a product that will help people who live in poverty, because this flies below the radar screen of the major pharmaceutical companies. I mean, the pharma companies do what they can to provide vaccines through the Gavi Alliance, but for new vaccines that only affect people who live in extreme poverty, diseases like schistosomiasis or Chagas disease, there's not a financial or business model out there for it. And that's what we've been trying to pioneer for the last 2 decades with some degrees of success, getting vaccines into clinical trials. Although, it's really tough given the complexity of making vaccines compared to, say, diagnostics or small molecule therapeutic drugs.
Right. Well, Dr. Hotez, I think climate change may also change attitudes, because I think in North America and in Europe, people think, oh, mosquitoes, malaria, that's a problem in Africa.
Right. Neglected tropical diseases. They're neglected because they're tropical, right?
But if climate change affects where mosquitoes and the kinds of mosquitoes can live and survive, then all of a sudden people may have to start thinking twice about malaria, Zika, chikungunya, dengue, and maybe even equine encephalitis. So we're going to need your vaccines pretty soon.
I think so. And that was the rationale for starting our National School of Tropical Medicine down here in the Gulf Coast in Houston, Texas, to be part of this amazing Texas Medical Center, because I started writing and speaking about the hidden diseases of hidden burden of tropical diseases among the poor on the Gulf Coast. was really interesting. And it wasn't only climate change. Climate change is a factor, but poverty is still the dominant force. So we call them tropical diseases, but they're more diseases of extreme poverty. But we have, by some estimates, my estimates, around 12 million Americans living with a poverty-related neglected tropical disease, such as hookworm infection or toxoplasmosis or Chagas disease. And
Whoa. Wait a minute, Dr. Hotez. Did you say hookworm in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, people think it was gone. It never really left, but it's hidden. It's in those pockets of extreme poverty that are scattered across the United States. And so we began working with an environmental justice activist, Catherine Coleman Flowers, a few years ago. And my one of my faculty members, Rogelio Mejia, went there, and he's developed a very sensitive PCR-based assay for looking for intestinal parasites, and was able to find hookworm and strongyloides and in Lowndes County, Alabama, and the list goes on of those diseases. The interesting part from a policy perspective is raising awareness about this has been really tough. I did a lot of work in the early 2000s raising awareness around neglected tropical diseases in Africa and other places where there are low and middle income countries, and getting some success working with the U.S. government, appropriating funds through USAID to support packages of simple low cost medicines for that. And we helped in the design and promotion of a package of drugs we call the Rapid Impact Package that's now given to more than 1 billion people a year. That we've been able to raise awareness and get funding from USAID, and then the British equivalent, which was DFID at the time. Now it's got a new name that I always have trouble remembering, but the UK government's been giving support. And I thought, hey, this global health advocacy stuff, it's not that hard. And then I tried to do the same about neglected infections of poverty in the U.S., and I've failed miserably, and we just can't get traction on it. People don't want to admit that we have poverty or diseases of the poor here in the U.S. Now we've made a little bit of headway with Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey and a couple of members of the House, Chris Smith of New Jersey and Hank Johnson of Georgia, but it's been a tough slog.
You're listening to Dr. Peter Hotez. He's a professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He's also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Dr. Hotez is the author of several books. His latest is Preventing the Next Pandemic: Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science.
After the break, we'll find out whether we'll likely need a booster shot against COVID variants next year.
Why should Americans care about vaccinating people in other places?
How much of a leap was it for Dr. Hotez to switch from tropical diseases to SARS-CoV-2 research?
We'll find out about the prospects for a vaccine against malaria.
How can we best prepare for the next pandemic?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. KAYA Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's KAYA Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Also by CocoVia Cocoflavanol supplements, including Memory Plus, available at cocovia.com. That's CocoVia.com.
Today we're talking with one of the country's leading vaccine experts. You may have seen his distinctive bow ties on television. He's helping us understand the role that vaccines have played in history and against the current pandemic.
Each year, malaria affects more than 200 million people worldwide. Hundreds of thousands die annually, many of them children. Americans may not perceive malaria as a problem for them, but climate change may bring the mosquitoes that carry malaria and other diseases into our backyards. Why is a malaria vaccine so important for public health?
We're talking with Dr. Peter Hotez, Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology. He's the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine and the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Dr. Hotez is the author of several books. The latest is Preventing the Next Pandemic: Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science.
Dr. Hotez, will we ever have a vaccine against malaria?
Oh, I think so. The first prototypes look promising. The RTSS malaria vaccine that was started actually at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research and then continued through by also NYU, also did a lot of fundamental research now supported by the Gates Foundation, and GlaxoSmithKline stepped up to help advance that. There are some issues with that vaccine, but it provides proof of concept, I think, that we can eventually crack this, and a number of groups are working on it. And I think we will have an anti-malaria vaccine. And one of the things I like to say about malaria vaccines is it doesn't mean we'll stop using bed nets, we'll stop using anti-malarial drugs, but it'll be a really important complementary technology.
Dr. Hotez, how do we plan for and prevent the next pandemic? After the title of your book, Preventing the Next Pandemic.
One of the things I point out is we have made improvements and we have created infrastructure over the years, although many people don't appreciate it or realize it. With every major pandemic, we have learned something, and we have put in some infrastructure in place to hedge against it. So after SARS in 2003, the international community responded by creating international health regulations, IHR 2005. After H1N1 pandemic flu in 2009, the Obama administration, together with the WHO, put in the Global Health Security Agenda. We've now got Gavi in place since 2000. After Ebola, at 2 consecutive meetings in Davos, there was an effort to create something called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, to support vaccines for pandemic threats. So we have made some improvements, and with each new pandemic, it exposes weaknesses. I think from my perspective, some of the big weaknesses that this particular pandemic exposed was our over-dependence on the need to innovate and our over-dependence on the multinational pharmaceutical companies. There was such an effort to produce these high-tech, innovative vaccines, which could not be scaled adequately beyond providing vaccines for the United States and Europe and a few other places. And they're great vaccines. I got the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and now I know I'm not going to go to the hospital or intensive care unit for COVID-19, which is great. But though that technology is still too new to provide the 4 or 5 billion doses of vaccines we're going to need for sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and other places.
Oh, well, Dr. Hotez, we too got the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and we're very pleased to have gotten it. I need to ask you, why is it important for Americans to think about vaccinating people in other places?
Well, the reason is, well, first of all, if we want to restore the global economy, aside from the obvious humanitarian interests, there's some enlightened self-interest. I'm one to restore the global economy. As we move into the summer and fall, I'm pretty confident America will vaccinate its way out of our epidemic, and we'll be able to travel domestically. We'll be able to go to restaurants. We may not need masks. We'll have a fairly normal quality of life, but we'll be on an island. Other than going to Israel or the United Kingdom, maybe a couple of Western European countries, we can't go anywhere. Africa will still be too treacherous, and Latin America too treacherous because of COVID-19. So the economy can only go so far before it hits a plateau. And as the virus accelerates in Africa and Latin America, we've seen how variants emerge, and variants don't recognize international boundaries. So we need to prioritize how to do that. And unfortunately, it's not going to happen with the Moderna mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech mRNA vaccines. I don't think it'll even happen with some of the adenovirus vaccines. That's why we've come in with our recombinant protein vaccine, which is, simple, low cost, unfussy, protein-based vaccine that uses the same technology as the hepatitis B vaccine that's been given globally for 40 years. It's been highly safe and very effective. And now we've partnered with a fantastic Indian vaccine producer, Biological E, and they're scaling it up to 1 billion doses. But, one of the problems was in the early days of this pandemic, I was going around raising money for it because everybody was so focused on the innovation. They kind of thought of our vaccine as is boring, and maybe it was boring, but you can make it for $1.50 a dose, and there's no upper bound to the amount you can make.
That is really good news. Dr. Hotez, I wanted to ask you, how much of a leap was it for your team to go from neglected tropical diseases to SARS-CoV-2?
Well, we benefited from the fact that about a decade ago, we adopted a coronavirus vaccine program. One of our collaborators who works on parasitic diseases, Sarah Lustigman, for a vaccine for river blindness, which is caused by a parasitic worm, introduced us to a group at the New York Blood Center. She said, "Hey, Peter, you got to meet these guys. They're, Shibu Jiang and Lanying Du. They're doing some really interesting work on these coronaviruses." And I was impressed with what they were doing. And it seemed like it was a straightforward enough problem. All you needed to do was create a humoral immunity and virus neutralizing antibodies to the spike protein. So we adopted it. We wrote a grant to the NIH, and we wound up making vaccines for SARS, the original SARS, and MERS. And then the program kind of halted because we couldn't get money to continue it. But when we saw the sequence for COVID-19 up on bioRxiv, a preprint server at the beginning of 2020, we looked at this and said, "Hey, we can do this." And then it was a matter of trying to get resources to make it happen. And fortunately, some of the Texas philanthropies came through for us, including the Clayburgh Foundation in Texas and Tito's Vodka of all places, and also the JPB Foundation and a few others. And that's how I was spending the early days of the pandemic, raising some money so we could get our vaccine launched. And we did. I mean, the team worked in the lab. We got special permission to be in the lab because at that time, with COVID transmission ramping up, you needed to have that ability, and transferred the technology to Biological E, which are an amazing group of people. And, Mary Elaine and I were on Zoom calls day in and day out, trying to advance this with our team in the lab, and the stars aligned, and it looks really exciting now. So we're thrilled to be able to make a difference to this terrible pandemic.
Well, Dr. Hotez, I think a lot of people are looking over their shoulder because they fear the variants. There are now so many that we've kind of lost count. The double mutant variant, the P1 variant, the B117 variant, we could go on. But there's thinking that, well, maybe we'll need a booster. and maybe there'll be a booster in 6 months or 9 months, and maybe we'll just keep needing boosters every 6 months for years to come. Can you look in your crystal ball and just tell us what you think is going to happen when we might begin to lose immunity? You said that you had the Pfizer-BioNTech. So if how long will it work, and when might we need a booster?
So I think, it's easy to get overwhelmed and feel hopeless, but when you break it down into pieces, it doesn't look too bad. So at least if you're in the United States. So right now it's the B.1.1.7 variant coming out of Southern England. That's the big problem. The good news is all of the vaccines in the U.S. program work just as well against the B.1.1.7 variant as the original lineages. That's going to be the dominant vaccine for the foreseeable future. Later on, maybe later in the year, next year, we'll start to see some variants of concern for which the vaccines don't work quite as well, including the B.1.351 from South Africa, the P1 from Brazil. And for that, the vaccines are all partially protective, but will likely want to get a booster that will give you immunity, not only more durable immunity, not only against the original lineages, but those variants as well. So what I've been saying is don't be surprised if the word comes out that we need a third immunization with an mRNA vaccine, which will not only make humoral antibodies and virus neutralizing antibodies more elevate that level and make it more durable, but will also that variant that booster will be modified to make it specific for one of the other emerging variants. And if you got a single dose J&J vaccine, you should already expect it'll likely turn into a 2-dose vaccine. And at that point, that may be it. And the reason I say that is there seems to be a lot of convergence of these variants. It's not like you're seeing hundreds of different ones. You're seeing the same recurring themes in terms of how the virus is evolving. It's the same small group of mutations. So I think that one booster may take care of it depending on how long the protection is. So I actually don't think we're going to need an annual immunization. It's not impossible, but I don't think we're going to be heading in that direction, but we'll see. And so that's why it's important to get vaccinated, have situational awareness, and not feel overwhelmed or hopeless, because our quality of life is going to look very good starting in the summer, moving into the fall. Yes, you may need a boost later on, but that's really no big deal in the big scheme of things. Also, even though masks and social distancing measures may relax in the summer and fall, and I think that will happen, remember there could be some seasonality to this virus. So starting in January, you may be asked to put masks on yet again and do some social distancing for that period. But that's what we're looking at. So it'll mean living with the virus, but our quality of life will really start to improve, and jobs are going to return. We have a lot to be hopeful for.
Dr. Hotez, if you were to look into your crystal ball and say, okay, my team needs to prepare for the next pandemic, and the title of your book is Preventing the Next Pandemic, what do you think it'll be? Where is the next problem going to arise?
Well, I think first of all, we have to fix some of the infrastructure. Just like we've learned from every pandemic, we've got to build vaccine development capacity across the world. Right now, no vaccines are made on the African continent. We have to fix that because not only do we need self-sufficiency for pandemic threats, but also regional diseases. Latin America terribly underachieves in its ability to make vaccines. We need to fix that. There are no vaccines made in the Middle East, and that's not a resource issue. The money's there. They've just have not organized themselves to develop vaccines. That's one piece. The other is we've got to do something about the anti-science empire. We've got to confront it. For too long, the U.S. government has held this position. Well, we're not going to call attention to it because it'll give it oxygen. And you know what? It's got all the oxygen it needs, and it's killing people. In fact, I have a paper that I wrote in the Public Library of Science and Plus called Anti-Science Kills, and we've got to figure that one out. And then we can start looking at what are going to be the next virus pandemics. You never know for certain. We know now we've seen a coronavirus pandemic every decade. We had SARS in 2003, MERS in 2012, now COVID-19. So we better get ready for COVID-26 and COVID-32. And we have some ideas around making a universal coronavirus vaccine and other groups as well. That's going to be important. And having that flexibility and infrastructure so we're not scrambling for dollars every time a new pathogen comes up, that would be helpful as well.
Finally, Dr. Hotez, do you think we'll be better prepared for the next pandemic?
You know, we improve with every pandemic. We make progress, and we've learned a lot of lessons from this one. This one may be the toughest for all of us, but it requires greater infrastructure, and it requires greater acknowledgement and support from the G20 countries, the group of 20 countries that account for 85% of the global economy. For too long, we've depended exclusively on the US, the UK, the Nordic countries, some of the other EU countries, then in organizations like the Gates Foundation, now with CEPI. And that's too small a pie. We need to get full involvement from China and Russia and India and Indonesia in order to support this kind of work.
Dr. Peter Hotez, I wish we could talk to you for a much longer time, but we're almost out of time. So let me say thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Well, it was a real honor, and thanks for all your work to get people to care about science and hear from scientists as well, because that's so critical for our future.
You've been listening to Dr. Peter Hotez. He's professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He's also co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. Dr. Hotez is the author of several books. His latest is Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. KAYABiotics.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1256. The number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning. You might want to share it with a friend or family member.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter and get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to the newsletter, you'll have regular access to our weekly podcast.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.